just start off by telling us what you can about the background and historical significance of these attacks happening between Israel and the Hamas?
I'll start with there was a UN mandate after World War II to split the territory that's now known as Israel-Palestine and to have two states, one for Jews and one for Palestinians. In 1948, Israel declared statehood. So Jews had been coming to Israel since the late 1880s. They had been buying land, establishing communities, and so on. And this was an area under the Ottoman Empire at the time. After World War II, it was under Britain. Britain sort of handed it over to the UN, and the UN had a plan to provide a two-state solution. So Israel moved very quickly in 1948 and established themselves as a state. They declared themselves as a state with sovereignty. One day after that, there was the first war against Israel. It was attacked by a number of surrounding Arab states. That war lasted a month or so. Israel prevailed, and that, it's been war and conflict ever since.
Those attacks that you just mentioned, was that the war in 1973?
No. There's been, as I said, there's been numerous wars. The first one was in 1948. The second one was in 1967. This was known as the Six-Day War. Also, Egypt and Syria and several surrounding states attacking Israel. 1973 was the Yom Kippur War. This recent attack was 50 years and 1 day to the date of that 1973 war. And so it was, a very significant date for this attack to take place.
What kind of message do you think it sends that the attacks happened on that date?
Well, that's a good question. I think it was partly the decision to attack on this date was probably partly just an issue of opportunity, because Yom Kippur is the most holy day for Jews, and typically there's all kinds of celebrations, and so I'm sure there was a feeling that they were going to be sort of unprepared. And as it turned out, they were. Just like with the Yom Kippur War, it was also a very surprise attack. They were not expecting it, and it was a great shock. So it's definitely sent a message that these conflicts continue.
So it sounds like from the history you just gave, the tension sounds like it started with Israel wanting to be its own individual entity, right? Wanting to be independent.
Well, I want to emphasize, this was the UN plan. This was passed by the UN. There was going to be an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. So yes, that's when the major conflict started, when Israel, declared its independence and became a sovereign state.
Can you clarify, the players in this whole situation? Like we're talking about Israel, we're talking about Palestine, we're talking about the Hamas, we're talking about a few different things that some people, at home and even us, we might need some education.
So, second group, obviously Palestinians. They were the Arabs that were in the area when the UN mandate was put in place. They were, Israel was roughly within the area that was designated by the UN, went through a war in 1948. Then the war in 1967, again, which was known as the Six-Day War. This was the war where Israel took a lot of territory. So again, they were attacked by 3 or 4 surrounding countries. They vanquished them very quickly. And they took over a number of territories, but one of them was the Gaza Strip. And that's, of course, the focus of the current conflict.
Are you What's the big deal there?
Let's see. Well, maybe we'll talk a little bit about Hamas, and that will become clear. So Hamas is an Islamic fundamentalist organization. They have both a political wing and a military wing. They were founded roughly in 1980, late 1980s, in the Gaza area, and they basically used Gaza as a base to attack Israel. They also, part of why they were formed, they challenged the traditional Palestinian political organization, which was known as the Palestinian Authority. And there was a lot of conflict actually between those two groups and a lot of fighting for control. What ultimately happened was in 2005, Hamas won the elections and took control of Gaza. So Hamas is now the political authority in Gaza. And all through the 90s and 2000s, they used Gaza to launch missile strikes, to launch bombings of civilians, lots of suicide bombings. So it's been kind of a source of, it's been kind of a base for attacks on Israel for quite some time.
And just so that I'm clear on the reason why this base has been used to attack Israel, it's because Israel kind of claimed that territory, the Gaza Strip.
Okay, yes, so ostensibly, much of the conflict revolves around these lands that Israel took in the 1967 war. One of them was the Gaza Strip, one of them was the West Bank, one of them was the Golan Heights. So basically, areas surrounding Israel proper. And yes, there's been lots of conflict over, should Israel give that land back? Who should govern? What's the status of Jerusalem, which is also a divided city? But another thing that gets lost in all this discussion is in 2005, as a result of a variety of things, but primarily the attacks from Gaza, Israel left Gaza. They took all Jews out of Gaza completely. They don't have any control over what goes on internally in Gaza since 2005. And that's also allowed Hamas to become, very dominant. So again, I think Gaza is really an important key to the whole conflict, again, because it was taken over in the 67 war. It was a source, it led to the rise of Hamas. It was a source of a lot of attacks on Israel. In 2005, Israel decided, okay, if the conflict really is about land, we're going to leave. And so they did. But in fact, the attacks, were increased after they left.
You brought up the Holocaust in your explanation, and there are so many people who are comparing the death toll right now to that of the Holocaust. Can you share why you think that is?
Well, I wouldn't in any way, shape, or form compare the death toll, because obviously the Holocaust is something unprecedented. But it is probably the most casualties that Israel has suffered since the Holocaust. They're saying now 800. I'm sure that number is probably going to increase as time goes on. And of course, there's maybe 120 hostages. Don't know how many of those are going to survive. So I would guess it's going to be upward of 1,000 when it's all. And of course, now Israel is bombarding Gaza aerially, and they're talking about a ground invasion. And if that happens, there'll be many more casualties, of course.
No, one of my questions you probably have some notes on is what it really takes for Israel to go into defense mode and protect themselves on a scale like this?
Yes. Israel typically, in my opinion, exercises extreme constraint. That's partly because they're supported by the U.S., and the U.S. is very strict about that. But again, they've had repeated attacks, depending on how you count it, 3 to 5 wars, with surrounding states attempting to eliminate them. Again, aerial bombings, suicide bombings, and so on. Typically, the response to all of that has been, well, in wars, obviously they fought the war, but typically the response to those kind of terrorist attacks has been, they have the Iron Dome, which is a missile defense system that the U.S. basically gave to Israel. That's how they've been able to protect themselves from the rocket attacks. With the suicide bombings and such, typically they'll try to do a surgical strike. They'll try to go in and take out the terrorist cell. And they do, again, in my opinion, make extreme efforts to not target civilians, to not hurt civilians. But given the scale of this attack, I don't think they're going to be as restrained as they have been in the past.
You mentioned Israel is supported by the U.S., and the U.S. is also supporting another big war in Ukraine right now. So people are wondering the extent to which the U.S. will get involved in this. And I was hoping you could shed some light on, just based on history, what you think, how far you think the U.S. will go.
Sure. Well, first, of course, Biden came out immediately and said, we support Israel, and Israel has a right to defend themselves. The U.S. has sent warships to the Eastern Mediterranean as a show of support. What's going to happen next is not entirely clear, but there is another terrorist group, and I should say the Hamas is considered a terrorist group by most Western countries. Not everyone in the world, but by most Western countries. There's another terrorist group also supported by Iran in Lebanon, just north of Israel. And they have said that if Israel does a ground invasion of Gaza, then they will attack from the north. The U.S. has responded to that by saying, you really don't want to do that. We don't, it could escalate. We don't know. I would guess all the major powers are doing everything they can to avoid escalation, but it's a very, very fluid situation.
But why not?
That's also a really good question. There's various theories of why now. I think the most important one is that there have been, under the Trump administration, there was what was known as the Abraham Accords. And this was agreements between Israel and several relatively smaller Middle Eastern states. The UAE was one, normalization of relations. So again, until pretty recently, there were only a small handful of states that recognized Israel's right to exist. Egypt and Jordan were the main ones. In the in the Trump administration, so in the past 4 or 5 years, there's been this normalization with a few more countries and Israel. So again, they're recognizing Israel's right to exist. They're renouncing violence against Israel. Very recently, it looked like Saudi Arabia was going to join that normalization. So there were talks, and this was led by the U.S., there were talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel to try to normalize relations. The major powers in the Middle East that are arrayed against each other is Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran, again, does not recognize Israel's right to exist, regularly says its goal is to wipe Israel off the map, supports the Hamas in Gaza, supports Hezbollah in Lebanon. If that normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia had gone through, and it may still, we don't know, but it's not looking too good at this point. But if it had succeeded, that would have really isolated Iran. That would have sort of arrayed a larger number of Middle Eastern states, normalizing relations with Israel, and sort of isolating Iran more as, one of the holdouts still, implacably opposed to Israel's existence. So many people are speculating that this was basically a move by Iran to derail the possible normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And, I don't want to say that they control everything that goes on with Hamas or Hezbollah, more with Hezbollah than Hamas, really. But they did, it's very clear, and it's been announced by both, certainly by Hamas, that Iran was very important in helping them with weapons, planning, money, intelligence, and so on. So, and I should say, I don't think this would have been possible on anywhere near the scale without the support of Iran. And ultimately the support of Russia. Russia is certainly, one of the questions asked too about this, I think, is who wins? Who wins from this? And I think obviously Hamas, they are able to demonstrate their prowess, their ability to fight, and so on. Iran, of course, because they can show that they can manipulate things in the Middle East. I think it's a very plausible argument that they were trying to derail that normalization with Saudi Arabia. But again, Russia is behind this as well, of course, by starting another war in another region of the world, takes attention off of Ukraine, spreads the West more thinly, can perhaps divide the West, which is certainly Putin's goal. So Hamas, Iran, Russia, and ultimately China. I don't think this would have happened without at least China's tacit approval.
We got a lot of players. We got a lot of mini conflicts and a big conflict. It's like soup.
Yeah. China has been very circumspect, and they've said, we want a two-state solution. Platitudes. We want a two-state solution and peace. But haven't come out and condemned Hamas's attack. Have just been kind of very, very circumspect, very much on the sidelines, and not really taking much of a position.
Does this hurt the NATO countries as well? That's a completely different ballpark that we're going into.
Well, the effect on NATO is basically, again, just this is another conflict that certainly the U.S. and the NATO leadership will want to keep the West unified to confront, but it's a conflict that's probably going to divide. I would say it is going to divide the West even more than Ukraine. So it's problematic in that sense. It's definitely going to make it, it's going to sort of bleed the West in terms of tension, weapons, money, etc. And it's probably going to make it easier for Russia to continue trying to divide the West.
Just a few more questions for you to get a good summary of this. For one, to make sure that I have a clear understanding, when people on the outside looking in are searching for who's responsible, who's the enemy, you're saying there are a lot of people who have a stake in this, and it's not just this terrorist group, the Hamas. It's a lot of different people who, many of them are behind the scenes.
Absolutely. No question. When you come to the question of who's responsible, obviously the most proximate is Hamas. They did this. But again, I don't think they could have come anywhere near what they've been able to do without Iran's support. I think it's worth mentioning when we come to this question of who's responsible or who do we blame and so on, to talk about this issue of the occupation. And that's, again, the 6-Day War in 1967. Israel was attacked. They defeated their adversaries very quickly, and they took a lot of territory. that's sort of the basis for the so-called occupation. But again, I think it's worth pointing out, number one, 20% of Israel's population is Arab, and they have full citizenship rights. Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005. They no longer have anything to do with what goes on internally in Gaza. It's governed by Hamas. So, of course, there are people who have different opinions on this, but I think the idea that Israel somehow is the cause of this because they responded to an attack on them by taking over land, I don't find that very tenable. And I guess I would say something like this. Israel is held to a standard that no other country in the world is held to. No other country in the world would sustain 3 to 5 wars, depending on how you count them and how big you think a war is, but certainly 3 to 5 or 6 wars, constant missile attacks, terrorist attacks. No other country in the world would tolerate that. I think they would have moved to what Israel is doing now much sooner.
But do you think Israel was so ready to respond because of how many attacks they've sustained over the years?
Well, certainly they have a formidable military, and I think they will prevail. They will be able to largely remove Hamas from Gaza. I think that is what's going to happen. But they certainly were not prepared for this attack. They were caught by surprise, and shockingly. Israel has a formidable military, world-renowned intelligence services. They had a border fence that has cameras and listening devices and so on. So it is, it's now coming out that Netanyahu, the Israeli government, was warned by Israel. Not by Israel, sorry, but let me start over. It's now coming out that the Israeli government was warned by Egypt that something was happening in Gaza. They were also warned by the Israeli, I'm not sure if it was the military or the intelligence services, but some people were making noise. This won't be fully understood for quite some time. But it appears that the Netanyahu government was a little bit asleep at the wheel.
Why should people here in the U.S., in Kansas City, even care about what's going on?
I think the main reason, several reasons. Israel is a very important U.S. ally. It is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's the eyes and ears of the U.S. in the Middle East. The U.S. certainly has complicated relations in the Middle East, but Iran is a clear geopolitical foe, and Israel is our ally, and our supporter, and we support them. I should say also, there are almost as many Jews in the U.S. as there are in Israel. There are something like 6 million Jews in Israel and something close to that in the U.S. as well. So, and that's of course part of the source of American support for Israel. But in general, the West has supported Israel as a result of what happened in the Second World War. And both their historic claim to the land, they were there 2,000 years ago, they were kicked out by the Romans. And then they went to Europe and Northern Africa and various other places. Ultimately, after the Second World War, there was already the movement, what's known as the Zionist movement, to create a state for the Jews in that territory. But the West has supported that largely, not always. And again, I would say they always insist that Israel exercise a great deal of restraint. But the West has supported Israel because of the Holocaust.
Do you have a follow-up question? Okay.
One thing I noted, so I think you were starting to define Hezbollah, but I don't know that you ever said the word Hezbollah. You mentioned them later. Would you want like a soundbite about explaining what Hezbollah is?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Definitely wouldn't hurt to get
Okay.
some clarification.
So yes, the risk of this escalating and becoming a regional war is partly due to the fact that there is an Islamist militia in Lebanon. They're very closely associated with Syria and Iran. They've been there for 20 years, more than that. And they are pretty much controlled by outside forces. And they largely took over Lebanese politics, roughly in the early 2000s. And they are also considered a terrorist organization by most Western states. They have attacked Israel numerous times across the Golan Heights, across the northern border. And they are, and I should say, Israel fought a war against Hezbollah in 2006. And it kind of, unlike many of the other wars where Israel won decisively, this was kind of a stalemate. Now,